Now, coming up, Alex Sundvall. Alex is going to talk to us about how we can tell the difference between flycatchers, or as Alex puts it, flycatchers simplified, although to me that's kind of an oxymoron. Anyway, Alex Sundvall is a proud Minnesota native and has truly loved birds all of his life. At the young age of 5, his kindergarten class took a field trip to their local nature center and learned all about birds. At the end of the trip, the class got to watch them release a dark-eyed jungle they had been rehabilitating, and from that moment on, he was hooked. With the help of his very supportive and encouraging parents, he learned everything he could about birds and birding. Even as a child, whenever anyone asked him what he wanted to be when he grows up, he would always say, "I'm going to be an ornithologist." Impressive that you could even pronounce that at that age, Alex. This love of birds and nature has followed him throughout his life. He graduated from the University of Minnesota's College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences with a degree in Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology and a double minor in Forest, Ecosystem Management and Conservation and Environmental Sciences, Policy, and Management. That is a lot of knowledge. In 2016, Alex received the Young Birder Award from the Minnesota Ornithologists Union and has served as an alternate on the State Bird Records Committee. Growing up in Minnesota, Alex developed a passion for studying bird migration. In the past, he has worked as both a counter and count interpreter at Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory in Duluth, Minnesota. Even now, in his free time, he'll often drive somewhere, post up for the day, and just count migrating birds as they pass by. Alex is currently a full-time guide with Field Guides Birding Tours, and over the years, he has led numerous tours across the U.S. and beyond, from Australia to Costa Rica, Texas to Alaska, and everywhere in between. He loves teaching people about birds and showing them all that nature has to offer. And here's Alex.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Can everybody hear me all right? Good. All right. I will share my screen here. Hopefully this will work. Share. Go to full screen.
It worked.
Perfect. All right. So this is my presentation, Flycatchers, Identification Made Easy. So that, like Susan mentioned, that's a bit of an oxymoron. I don't think flycatchers are really all that easy, unless they're a scissor-tailed flycatcher, like the cover slide here. If only all the flycatchers could be as easy as this one. So I'm just going to try to share with you some of my own tips and tricks and what I look for in flycatchers and how to ID them. And hopefully you'll learn something along the way. And should have some time at the end for questions, for people to clarify things. And yeah, if there's anything else that I didn't go over you'd like to know. So first off, we have to start to break up our flycatchers, this kind of big challenging group, into subtypes to try to categorize what we're looking at. So in Minnesota, there are 5 different types of flycatchers. You have the peewees, which are kind of a medium-sized flycatcher. They have somewhat larger bills. They're very long-winged. They're longer distance migrants, and they've got kind of bigger heads compared to the empids or empidonax or empidonax, depending on how you pronounce it. That's a genus of the smaller flycatchers. They're typically a little more cutesy in appearance, and they, as a group, are very varied depending on, migration lengths and other things, habitat. We've got phoebes, which some of you might be surprised we've got more than one phoebe in Minnesota. I just listed them as tail waggers. Behaviorally, it can be a really good way to identify flycatchers, what they're doing, where they're doing it. Myarchus is another genus. That's our great crested flycatcher. That belongs to a bigger genus of Myarchus flycatchers. They're very big, very colorful flycatchers. And then the kingbirds are our final grouping of flycatchers in Minnesota. And the kingbirds are big, they've got big, bold colors and more open habitats usually. So let's start with our first group, the peewees. Our first peewee is not named peewee. It is the olive-sided flycatcher. And so all of my slides are going to kind of look like this. We've got a big picture that I think is rather demonstrative of what the species looks like, and then some bullet points on the left of things to look for. And then at the bottom there is a nice map of occurrence in Minnesota. And that's actually on the same page as those graphs that Andy was showing. It's MOU data in the detailed occurrence information. That page and that group of pages details all of the species of Minnesota and gives a wonderful trove of information on pretty much anything that you could want to know about occurrence details on any bird in Minnesota. It's really, really useful. So I've got that for all of our flycatchers today. So olive-sided flycatcher, they've got a very big bill. They're very big-headed compared to any of the other smaller flycatchers. They've got very long primaries, kind of typical of the peewees. And because their primaries are so long, they also have a shorter tailed appearance. And they've got a really clear vested look on the front. So those sides, the side flanking there is really, really bold and looks like it's wearing a vest. And looking at the occurrence information on the bottom left, you can pretty much find it anywhere in Minnesota. They breed up in the Arrowhead and kind of northern Minnesota, but you can find it especially like going through the eastern part of the state. Our next peewee is the eastern wood peewee. This is actually named peewee. And this bird has really bold wing bars. That's something to help with olive-sided flycatcher, not the most bold of wing bars. This one has very bold wing bars. It also has very long primaries, but does not have the short-tailed appearance. It's still very long-tailed looking. And it has a very limited eye ring, and that'll help us out in the future. And then looking at our map of Minnesota, pretty much everywhere in the state, equally common. It's a very common bird for us in Minnesota. You're probably familiar with hearing them. If not, it's a pretty easy song to recognize and learn. I would recommend learning it. Now we've got some fun comparison slides. I saw that Bob had one of these for some flycatchers. It looked a lot like my slide actually. So this is a comparison of olive-sided flycatcher and eastern wood peewee. So again, looking at on the olive-sided flycatcher, that really nice dusky vest on the flanks compared to on the peewee. It's dusky on the front, but not as clearly vested. Usually has a bit of a yellowish belly in between the flank vesting as opposed to a nice white belly on the olive-sided flycatcher. Again, looking at those really long primaries, but then comparing it with the tail length, look at how much shorter the tail looks on the olive-sided flycatcher compared to where the wings meet. Whereas the peewee is very long-tailed looking still. And then again, the wing bars, not very bold on olive-sided flycatcher and bolder on the peewee. Now we have probably the most diverse and difficult group of flycatchers in Minnesota, the dreaded empids. So starting out relatively easy is the yellow-bellied flycatcher. They are going to be one of the smaller looking empids, very cutesy looking. They're going to have very cute looking faces. That's due to their very bold eye ring, big eyes on their head, and a very small bill. Yellow-bellied flycatchers are very yellowish green overall, and also very long primaries on these. So when I'm talking about the primaries, I'm really talking about the extension from that feather there. So looking at how long this wing looks. It's a very subtle detail, but it can be really important when looking at flycatchers and how to identify them. With yellow-bellied flycatcher, these wings are really, really long. That's due to because they're a longer distance migrant. Um, they have a slurred call, kind of like a peewee actually, um, which audio can be really useful to identify flycatchers. Unfortunately, the program I use to build the presentation does not allow audio. So if we have audio questions, I can try something sketchy, like playing it on my phone at the end of the presentation. But that's the yellow-bellied flycatcher. Looking at occurrence details in Minnesota, they breed up in the arrowhead, so you can see that bold dark blue color is where they breed. A little bit of skewing because of how many birders there are in the Twin Cities area, so they're they look to be most common in the eastern part of the state, but they are. I mean, they breed up in the northeast part of the state, so not as many breed in the western part of the state, so not as many migrate through the western part of the state. Acadian flycatcher is kind of the bigger version of yellow-bellied flycatcher. Everything about them is bigger. They also they have a large, big head. They're very heavy build. The bill compared to yellow-bellied, very small. This one's big and blunt. They've got a very thin eye ring. They're very green overall, not as yellowish green as yellow-bellied flycatcher, kind of more of an olivey green. They also have very long primaries, and they're very habitat specific in Minnesota. They like rivers, typically with some steep cliffs around, and pretty much only in the very southeast part of Minnesota. There are some around the Twin Cities and up in Washington County, even in Chisago County, but pretty much other than that, like they're just along the river corridor, the Mississippi River corridor, and some of the offshoots of the Mississippi. So very habitat specific in Minnesota. Very unlikely to see them out of habitat. And then now alder flycatcher starts to get our very famous difficult flycatcher pair, the trails flycatcher. Kind of one of the purveying thoughts is that they're not strictly visibly identifiable compared to willow flycatcher. But there's trends for each species. So we can look at the trends for alder flycatcher. So they typically have a noticeable eye ring. In this picture, you can see it's got a fairly noticeable eye ring. Typically, it's a more rounded head, and they're more greenish toned on the back and overall. Typically, you're going to find them in the more north and eastern parts of Minnesota. So looking at that occurrence map, a lot of this is the breeding zone, but they breed kind of north of the I-94 corridor. They give these really short pip calls as an audio clue, and that's very different from some of the other flycatchers. And their song is a burry rebeer. It's very slurred. It's an accent on the second part of the song compared to willow flycatcher. There's typically little or no eye ring on those. It's more of a crested head. So looking at kind of that bump out of the head, it's a little more crested. They're usually a bit more grayish toned compared to the greenish tones of the alder flycatcher. And usually you find them in more southern and western Minnesota. So looking at the map again, almost a complete inverse of the alder flycatcher map. They breed mostly south of the I-94 corridor. They have harsh wit or weck calls, which is very different from the kind of more bubbly pip call of the alder flycatcher. And their song is more of a scratchy fritz pew. And oftentimes I find in my ears, it's more the first note that is accented on the willow flycatcher's song. Now we've got least flycatcher, which is very small and kind of the most cutesy looking, as I say. So it's got, again, those big eyes, a fairly bold eye ring, very small bill. They have very short primaries. So thinking about your other small and cutesy flycatcher, the yellow-bellied flycatcher, that had very long primaries. The least flycatcher has very short primaries. They're also kind of that more grayish green toned overall as opposed to yellow bellied, the yellow and green tones. And they give really soft whip calls. In terms of a flycatcher in Minnesota, there's a pretty good chance this is the one that you're seeing if you look at the occurrence information. They're very common statewide. We have a very high percent of the population of least flycatchers in Minnesota. So chances are good if you are seeing a flycatcher, it's this one. And then you can, if you don't think it's this one, you can start to explore other options of what it could be. So here are some comparison images for these empids and really looking at things that I thought were very similar to each other. Not looking at alder versus willow, because again, they're kind of, we're not entirely sure if we can 100% quantify and identify every single one of that pair visually only. Audio-wise, they're very distinct, but visually very, very similar. So looking at kind of mostly similar looking birds. So with least flycatcher and alder flycatcher, which I think are the two to really separate, least flycatchers have a very bold eye ring. Looking at that eye ring compared to the alder flycatcher on the right, it has one, but it's not as bold. And that's pretty standard across the two species. Least flycatchers should average a much bolder eye ring compared to alder flycatchers. Looking at the bill, alder flycatcher's bill is going to be a little bit bigger. It's going to be a little bit stouter, not giving it that cutesy appearance that I really think that least flycatcher on the left is showing. It's got the big eyes, the small bill. And then looking at the primary length, it's very subtle, but least flycatcher is going to average a much shorter primary projection than the alder flycatcher. So again, looking at that extension of the primaries there versus there. And then eastern wood pewee versus willow flycatcher can be a very difficult ID as well if you're just seeing the birds. And looking at these two birds, I tried to pick photos where they were in similar postures, similar angles to really accentuate the similarities and hopefully accentuate the differences. One of the main ones that we can look at is the primary length. So again, looking at how long these wings are coming out of the primary extension. These are very, very long winged birds, the pewees, compared to the willow flycatchers, which are quite noticeably shorter, looking at where these wings fall on the tail compared to the two. Then looking at the head shape, willow flycatcher is going to be a bit more rounded than the eastern wood pewee. It's going to be a smaller looking head. This pewee looks much larger headed, also larger billed, looking at the bill between the two. Phoebes, a little bit easier to tell the phoebes apart compared to the empids. So our main phoebe in Minnesota is eastern phoebe. One of the things that I always look for with eastern phoebe, they've got a really dark head, and that head really contrasts from the rest of the back and the body. One of the first things that I can key in on. They also have really faint or no wing bars. So most of our flycatchers do have wing bars. So the fact that this has got a dark head and very faint or no wing bars kind of starts to put me in the idea that this is an eastern phoebe. Behaviorally also, the phoebes are really nice. If you could see this bird in video as opposed to in picture, they wag their tail up and down pretty constantly. This is a bird that's very common across the state. I'm sure most of the people in this presentation have seen a phoebe. They're starting to arrive in the next few weeks, I imagine. They're one of the first migrants back. You can see them pretty much anywhere in the state. Say's phoebes, I was debating whether to include this in the presentation, but they are considered regular in the state, so I figured I may as well throw them in. But they are much more specific than eastern phoebes. They're pretty much only reliably found in the very, very, very far western part of the state. They're always in pretty much open prairie. But they've got this really nice peachy vent and belly. The vent is kind of right underneath the belly and the tail there. All this really nice peachy brown color. They have a very contrasting dark tail. So compared to eastern phoebe with the dark head, Say's phoebes have a really dark tail. And again, they're very habitat specific. They're very specific to Western Minnesota. You're very unlikely to see them anywhere else in the state, although they can show up in the Twin Cities or along the lake shore. But they're fairly distinctive looking, which is nice. You don't have the hard ID challenge of the Empidonax flycatchers to identify a Say's phoebe. But eastern phoebes can be somewhat challenging to tell apart from eastern wood peewees. Maybe just because their names are very similar, eastern peewee, eastern phoebe. But I see this as a confusion for a lot of people. So again, looking at the head, that eastern phoebe has a really contrasting dark head. And looking at the wing bars, eastern wood peewee has really bold wing bars, typically 2, even 3 can appear. These really bold wing bars versus the phoebe doesn't really have wing bars at all. And then looking at the bill, eastern wood peewees typically have a yellow mandible, that lower bill, and phoebes are going to be all dark. Myarchus, really easy for us. We have one species, the great crested flycatcher. These are going to have a really big, heavy bill, that shaggy crested head, yellow and brown body plumages with some gray on the face, and there's lots of rufous in the tail and in the wing. So you can see that in this picture, all this rufous in the primaries, the rufous in the undertail, that lemon yellow belly, the grayer face, and that shaggy brown crest. Myarchus identification is really challenging in other parts of the country and across the neotropics where there are multiple species that all kind of look very similar to each other. Thankfully, in Minnesota, we only have the one regular species, so we don't have that identification headache to work through. A lot of people think that Myarchus ID is actually more challenging than Empid ID, which you think about how big of a headache that Empid ID was. Myarchus can be even trickier. So I'm very happy that we only have the one here. Kingbirds. So we have 2 species of kingbird regular in Minnesota. First is our western kingbird. They've got this nice yellow belly and gray body plumage. They have a solid gray head with a thin black mask usually. And they've got white edging on the outer tail feathers, which you can see this thick white edge on the tail feathers here. That's really useful. And in terms of where to find them in Minnesota, true to their name, pretty much just in the western part of the state. They do start to creep into the eastern part of the state. I know there's been some fairly reliable nesting birds in Anoka County and Stearns County and Sherburne, leading to this darker blue color in the center of the state. But primarily, you're not going to find them until you hit the western prairie counties. Now, the second kingbird is eastern kingbirds. They are pretty much dark blackish gray above. They've got, and then a gleaming white belly below, very stark yellow, white belly. Okay, white belly. And they've got a really nice white tail band on their tail feathers. So that comes across the whole outer side of the tail feathers. The whole end of the tail feathers is that nice white tip. And they are found everywhere in Minnesota. They're pretty common once you get to the open habitats. So thinking of comparisons, it's actually the most challenging to look at Western kingbird and great crested flycatcher. I see this challenge pop up quite a bit. You can look at the head plumage there. So again, that great crested flycatcher's just got a gray face with that shaggy brown crest. whereas the kingbird has that thin black mask or thin darker mask and an all gray head. And then looking at the tail, again, Western kingbirds have that dark tail with the white outer edging to the tail feathers, and great crested flycatchers are very rufusy brown. And then Eastern phoebe versus Eastern kingbirds can be, it's not something that maybe you think about as being challenging, but looking at the pictures, it can actually be a little challenging. But you should look at the bill shape and bill size. So Eastern phoebes are a lot thinner build. Eastern kingbirds are very thick, stout build and a bit bigger build. And looking at the tail tip again, Eastern phoebes just a dark tail versus Eastern kingbird has that really good contrasting white tail tip. So that's what I have for you today. That's an overview of Minnesota's flycatchers and my sort of process of what I look at and how to identify them, where you can expect to maybe see them geographically in the state. And I will open up for questions. If anybody has any questions to put in the chat or ask of me.
Yeah, Sean has a question, Alex, which is, are flycatchers other than the Acadian berry habitat specific?
I mean, in breeding for sure. I mean, there's definitely places you can find the other flycatchers, but I find that even in migration, Acadian flycatchers are fairly habitat specific. I really don't see them outside of their habitats. But yeah, breeding habitats are pretty specific. Alder flycatchers, you're usually in a bog of some sort in northern Minnesota or like some sort of brushland habitat. Lots of kind of big willowy alder vegetation. Willow flycatcher, it's usually a little more open in the southern part of the state. Some sort of a bushy tree line, but I find them more in like prairie adjacent habitats. Versus alder, it's usually thicker habitats. Yellow-bellied flycatchers are a bit more bog specific. Least flycatchers are pretty much in any forest. They're a very dominant species in Minnesota. The kingbirds are typically open habitat. Phoebes, I find usually near water. Yeah, that's probably good.
Okay. Kingbirds will fly up and then back down. Do other flycatchers exhibit that behavior?
Yeah, so actually, true to its name, that behavior that you're describing is called fly catching or sallying, where they start at one perch, they go up, they catch a bug, and they come back to typically the same perch. And yeah, that is somewhat it's bug eater specific, but the flycatchers are famous enough for it that that's what they named the behavior. So yes, pretty much all the flycatchers will do that.
There's a question from someone in North Dakota. Will she be able to see any of these flycatchers in North Dakota?
In North Dakota? Yeah. Yeah. Admittedly, I'm not as familiar with the species distributions in North Dakota, but certainly, Say's phoebes are going to get a bit more common out that way since they're more of a prairie specialist, especially looking more towards the central and western part of the state. You're not going to get like the bog specific ones as easily. Like yellow-bellied flycatcher, I think would be a bit trickier, though I don't know about if they breed like up in Turtle Mountain or kind of along the Pembina Gorge area. But a lot of those birds, yeah, you'll be able to see in North Dakota.
Excellent. And one last question. So you were saying that the great crested flycatcher is really the only Myarchus species in Minnesota. Are there any accidentals that come through that we should be keeping our eyes out for?
Yeah, so I intentionally left accidentals out for time and for complication, because that could open up a whole new can of worms for IDs, because then you add a few more species of empids that you can look out for that are very confusing with the ones that we have here. There are Myarchus flycatchers that show up as extraliminal records, ash-throated being one of the big ones that shows up. Minnesota, I think, has 2 or 3 records of ash-throated flycatcher. There's one that has not shown up in a few years, so we're kind of looking. We feel like we're maybe overdue for another record of that, especially with how prevalent they've been in other parts of the region. So that's definitely one to study, and that's a very challenging ID. You can look. Myarchus ID is essentially all based on undertail patterns. So unless you have a really nice view of the undertail, it can be really challenging. There's a brand new book that came out from Princeton. It's the Flycatcher ID guides by Sin Tai Lee and Andy Birch. And they did their Empids and Peewees last year, and I believe just this month or maybe last month came out with Kingbirds and Myarchus flycatchers. So if you're really looking at studying undertail patterns of Myarchus flycatchers, that is the book that just came out and details it really, really well. There's
Awesome.
phenomenal illustrations of all those things to look for.
Could you put the name of that book and the author in the chat?
Yeah, I
And,
can do
and
that.
Alex, we're out of time. Thank you
Perfect.
so much. Very informative, cleared up some of my misunderstandings for sure. Truly appreciate the time that you have spent putting together that beautiful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I
Absolutely.
appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely.